The way, everything would finally be simple. I did not speak. I could hear Sandra downstairs washing a mug. I could hear Emma turning over in the guest room. I could hear my own pulse. Lena started crying and said she was scared of him now, truly scared, because she had found something hidden behind the dresser after he left, something taped under the bottom drawer where he probably thought no one would look. She sent me a photo. It was a small black flash drive. There was no label, no explanation, just one strip of masking tape wrapped around it with Mark's handwriting on top. C.M. Final. I stared at those letters until they stopped looking like initials and started looking like a sentence. Claire Mitchell. Final. And in that moment, I understood that the worst part of my husband's lie had not been uncovered yet. It had only been waiting for someone to open the file. Lena's photo stayed on my screen while the room around me seemed to lose its edges. Because there was something horrifyingly personal about seeing my initials written in Mark's handwriting on a black flash drive hidden inside the nursery dresser that I had unknowingly paid for, as if my husband had taken my name, my credit, my medical history, my signature, my marriage, and now maybe even my future, and reduced all of it to 3 cold letters and one word that sounded like an ending. C.M. Final. I read it once, then again. Then a third time, slower, because my mind kept trying to turn it into something ordinary, some business file, some final invoice, some client materials, anything except what my body already understood. Sandra came upstairs when she heard my breathing change, and I showed her the photo without saying a word, because at that point language felt too small for the shape of what was happening. She looked at it, then looked at me, and her face hardened in a way I had never seen before. Do not let Lena plug that into anything, she said. That sentence snapped something practical back into me. I called Lena immediately, and when she answered, she was whispering from her bathroom, because Mark had left the apartment, but she was still afraid he might come back. Still afraid every sound in the hallway was his key in the lock. Still afraid the man who had promised to protect her was actually the person she needed protection from. I told her to put the flash drive in a plastic bag, not to touch it more than she already had, not to open it, not to delete anything from her phone, and to call the detective from a number I gave her while staying somewhere public if she could safely leave. She started crying again, and this time I did not feel anger toward her. I felt a terrible, exhausted kinship. Because we were 2 women standing on different sides of the same lie, both realizing too late that Mark had not loved either of us the way he claimed, because love does not require forged signatures, hidden folders, secret apartments, or women whispering into phones like they are reporting a fire. By morning, the detective had the flash drive. By noon, Marisol had filed emergency motions connected to the debt, the forged lease, and the protection order. By 3 in the afternoon, I was sitting across from a financial crimes investigator in a room that smelled like burnt coffee and copy paper, watching him slide printed screenshots across the table while my attorney sat beside me with a yellow legal pad and a face that gave nothing away. The investigator told me they had found files on the drive. Not one file. Dozens. There were scanned copies of my identification, my medical forms, my signature samples, bank statements, pay stubs, credit reports, loan documents, insurance drafts, apartment paperwork, and photographs of pages I had signed without realizing Mark had kept the blank sections above my signature visible enough for someone to reuse. I felt Marisol's hand touch my wrist under the table. Not comforting. Grounding. Because the next page showed something that made me feel like I had been pushed underwater. It was a spreadsheet. My name was at the top. Claire Mitchell. Then columns for monthly income, projected debt load, home equity, life insurance eligibility, pension value, nursing schedule, vehicle value, and something labeled risk window. Risk window. I stared at those words until they stopped looking like English. The investigator explained that they could not yet say exactly what Mark intended, because intent had to be proven carefully, but the spreadsheet appeared to calculate how much financial pressure could be placed on me before bankruptcy, divorce, or a claim process became complicated. A claim process. Nobody said death. Nobody had to. I asked what risk window meant, and the investigator looked at Marisol before answering, which told me the truth before his words did. He said it appeared to reference my night shift schedule, my commute, the hospital parking lot, and periods when I would be alone, exhausted, and predictable. For a moment, the room went silent in a way that felt almost physical. Then I remembered every late drive home from the hospital, every dark stretch of road, every time Mark had told me my tires looked worn, every time he had offered to check the car before my shift, and every time I had thanked him because I thought he was being thoughtful. My stomach twisted so violently I had to press my hand against it. Marisol asked if there were any communications between Mark and Calvin Rhodes. The investigator turned another page. There were texts. Not enough to explain everything. Enough to make the room colder. Calvin had written, "She signs too easy when you keep it emotional." Mark had responded, "She thinks it's for the business." Another message said, "Insurance won't move without clean medical." And Mark had written, "I can get what you need." I covered my mouth with my hand because I was suddenly afraid I might make a sound Emma would somehow hear from across town, even though she was safe at Sandra's house, curled under a blanket, pretending to watch a movie while her childhood quietly split in two. The investigator kept going, gently but firmly, because facts do not become kinder when they are delayed. There was also a draft letter addressed to the credit union, supposedly from me, stating that all funds from the loan had been used for approved business purposes, that I accepted full responsibility for repayment, and that I did not wish to dispute any related charges. My signature was already pasted at the bottom. Not perfect, but close. Close enough for a tired employee. Close enough for a rushed process. Close enough for the world Mark counted on, where women like me are too ashamed, too busy, too loyal, or too scared to challenge paperwork that already looks official. That was when something inside me shifted. Not healed. Not softened. Shifted. I had spent the last 2 days feeling like a fool, like a wife who had missed too many signs, like a mother who had let danger come too close to her child, like a woman who had confused sacrifice with strength until sacrifice became a trap. But sitting there, looking at that forged letter, I stopped blaming the version of myself who had believed him. She had been tired. She had been loyal. She had been manipulated by someone who knew every password to her heart. And now she was gone. In her place was a woman with evidence, a lawyer, a detective, a daughter to protect, and a very clear understanding that silence would only make Mark stronger. That evening, officers arrested Calvin Rhodes first. Mark was arrested 2 hours later outside a gas station near Springfield, carrying a duffel bag, $6,000 in cash, 2 burner phones, and my old passport, the one I had reported missing after a trip to Florida 3 years earlier. When the detective told me, I did not feel relief at first. I felt hollow. Relief came later, in small pieces, like warmth returning to frozen fingers. Emma cried when I told her he would not be coming to Sandra's house. Lena cried when the detective told her she could be moved to a safer place before the baby came. And I sat on the edge of Sandra's guest bed that night, staring at the wall, realizing that the man I had once trusted to drive our daughter to school had been carrying my passport like I was something he could move, erase, or use whenever his plan required it. The next weeks were ugly. There is no clean way to explain how a life comes apart when police reports, loan disputes, divorce filings, school counselors, victim statements, frozen credit, and a teenager's broken heart all arrive at the same table. Mark called from jail twice before the no-contact order tightened. I did not answer. He wrote one letter through his attorney, saying he had been under pressure, saying Calvin had manipulated him, saying he never meant for things to go this far, saying I knew the real him and should not let one terrible season erase 14 years. Marisol read the letter first and asked if I wanted it. I said no. Then I changed my mind. Not because I missed him. Because I wanted to see whether he ever said the words, "I am sorry." He did not. He said he was scared. He said he was desperate. He said he felt cornered. But he never said he was sorry for what he did to me, to Emma, to Lena, or to the unborn child he had already dragged into a life built on prove it, the air around the person changes. His explanations started sounding rehearsed. His kindness started feeling timed. His kisses started landing on my forehead instead of my mouth, like he was blessing me from a distance instead of loving me up close. Over the next week, Mark became busy in a new way, not the old messy business busy that left sawdust on his boots and invoices on the dining table, but a polished kind of busy, with sudden evening meetings, locked phone calls in the garage, and quick trips to Dayton that always seemed to happen right after I asked one question too many. He said the loan had opened doors. He said new opportunities were coming. He said I needed to trust the process. And every time he said trust, I felt something inside me pull back. I started checking our accounts before my shifts, sitting in my car outside the hospital while the sunrise turned the windshield gray, scrolling through transactions with hands that smelled like sanitizer and cheap coffee. At first, the charges looked explainable if I wanted them to. A furniture store in Dayton, a baby boutique, a home goods shop, a moving company deposit, a payment to something called North River Leasing. When I asked Mark about North River, he said it was equipment storage because he had to rent space near the Dayton project to keep materials closer to the job site, and he acted annoyed that I would even question it after everything he had told me. That night, he did not come home until almost midnight. He kissed my cheek while I pretended to sleep, and I smelled a perfume on his jacket that was soft, sweet, and expensive, the kind of scent I never wore because nurses learn quickly that strong perfume does not belong near sick people. I lay there with my eyes closed until he fell asleep. Then I got up, took his jacket from the chair, and searched the pockets with my heart beating so hard I could hear it in my ears. I found a gas receipt, a folded parking stub, and a tiny pink hair tie caught in the seam of the inside pocket. Not mine, not our daughter's. Our daughter, Emma, was 16 and had worn black hair ties since middle school because, according to her, pink is emotionally aggressive. I stood in the dark hallway holding that little elastic band between my fingers, and something about how small it was made everything feel worse. A lipstick stain would have been dramatic. A hotel receipt would have been obvious. But this tiny pink hair tie felt domestic. It felt lived in. It felt like someone else's ordinary life had been brushing up against my marriage while I was working overtime to pay for it. The next morning, I called the number on the North River leasing transaction from the hospital break room, using the calm voice I used with difficult families, and when a woman answered, I said I was calling to confirm the mailing address on the account because I had not received a full statement. She asked for my name. I said Claire Mitchell. There was a pause. Then she said, yes, Mrs. Mitchell, we have you listed as the responsible party. For a moment, the vending machine behind me sounded louder than her voice. I asked what unit the payment was for, expecting a storage locker, a warehouse bay, maybe some ugly industrial space filled with lumber and cabinet doors. Instead, she gave me the address of a 2-bedroom apartment in Dayton, then added that the lease had been signed 3 weeks earlier, and that the move-in condition report had already been completed. I pressed my palm against the wall because the room tilted. I asked if Mark Mitchell was also on the lease. She said yes, but his name was listed as an authorized occupant. Mine was listed as financially responsible. I do not remember ending the call. I only remember walking back to the nurse's station with my face burning, smiling at a coworker who asked if I was okay, and saying I was fine because women like me are very good at bleeding quietly. That afternoon, I told my charge nurse I had a family emergency, drove home, changed out of my scrubs, and sat in my car for almost 20 minutes with the Dayton address typed into my GPS. Every reasonable part of me said not to go alone. Every frightened part of me said I needed proof before Mark could talk me out of my own instincts. So I drove. The apartment complex sat behind a row of young maple trees, clean and beige and painfully normal, with balconies full of potted plants and little welcome mats that made me feel like I had entered someone else's dream by mistake. I found the building, then the door. Apartment 214. There was a wreath hanging on it, pale yellow, with a wooden letter M tied in the center. M. Mitchell. My last name. My husband's last name. The one I had signed on that loan. I was still staring at that letter when the door opened. A young woman stood there, maybe 28, one hand resting on a very pregnant belly, wearing one of Mark's old gray Ohio State hoodies. And when she saw me, Her face did not look guilty. It looked confused. Then she smiled politely and said, "Can I help you?" Before I could answer, a baby mobile began playing softly somewhere inside the apartment, and behind her, on a small entryway table, I saw a framed photo of Mark kissing her forehead. For a few seconds, I could not speak, because the woman standing in front of me was not the hard-faced mistress I had imagined during the drive, not some cruel stranger who knew exactly what she had taken, but a soft-looking pregnant woman with tired eyes, swollen ankles, and one hand resting protectively over the child my husband had apparently been preparing a nursery for with money I had borrowed in my own name. She looked at me like I was a delivery person who had come to the wrong door. And somehow that made it worse. Because if she had looked guilty, I could have hated her immediately. If she had slammed the door, I could have chased the anger. But her confusion was real, and that meant Mark had not only lied to me. He had probably lied to her too. I swallowed hard, glanced past her shoulder at the framed photo on the entry table, and saw Mark wearing the navy sweater I had bought him for Christmas, standing inside what looked like that same apartment, smiling with a kind of relaxed warmth I had not seen on his face at home in months. My chest felt tight. My hands went cold. Then I heard myself ask, in a voice that sounded far calmer than I felt, if Mark was there. The woman's polite smile flickered. She pulled the door a little closer to her body, just enough to block my view, and asked who I was. That question should have been simple. I was his wife. I had been his wife for 14 years. I had slept beside him during layoffs, hospital scares, tax debt, family funerals, and every ugly little season of adult life that either breaks a marriage or welds it together. But standing in that hallway, with a wreath on the door and my last initial hanging above her pregnant belly, I felt like the answer had been stolen from me before I could say it. So I said my name, Claire Mitchell. The color drained from her face so quickly that I knew she recognized it, and for one wild second I thought maybe she knew everything. Maybe she had been laughing at me from behind those walls while I worked double shifts and signed bank papers. Then she whispered, "You're his sister?" I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because my body did not know what else to do with that much humiliation. I told her I was his wife, and the hallway became so quiet that even the baby mobile inside seemed to slow down, its soft little song turning thin and eerie behind us. Her hand slid from her stomach to the doorframe. She stared at me like I had walked out of a nightmare. Then she shook her head and said Mark was divorced. Not separated. Not complicated. Divorced. He had told her I was his ex-wife, that we had a daughter together, that I was bitter about the past, that I sometimes caused problems because I could not accept his new life, and that if I ever contacted her, she should not believe anything I said. That was the moment I understood how carefully he had built the cage around both of us. He had not just hidden her from me. He had prepared her against me. He had turned my future pain into a story before I even knew I was bleeding. I reached into my purse with shaking fingers and pulled up a family photo from 3 months earlier, taken at Emma's winter choir concert, where Mark stood beside me with his arm around my waist and his wedding ring visible on his hand. Lena stared at the screen. Her lips parted slightly. Then she backed away from the door as if the picture itself had pushed her. I did not step inside, because something about entering that apartment felt like stepping into a crime scene where the crime was my own marriage. But from where I stood, I could see enough. There was a new gray couch. A box from the baby boutique I had seen on the bank statement. A white dresser still partly covered in plastic. A stack of tiny folded clothes on the coffee table. And on the kitchen counter, beside a bottle of prenatal vitamins, sat a set of keys on a leather keychain embossed with the initials M. Mark Mitchell. My husband. Her boyfriend. The father of whatever life he was building there. Lena lowered herself into a chair near the entryway, breathing carefully, and asked me if I wanted to come in, but I shook my head because my legs already felt unsteady, and I was afraid that if I crossed that threshold, something in me would collapse in a way I could not hide. She said she was 29 weeks pregnant. She said Mark had rented the apartment for them because her old place had stairs. She said he had promised they would move into a house after the baby came. She said he had told her the business was finally recovering because he had found a private investor. A private investor. That was what he had called me. Not wife. Not partner. Not the woman risking her credit, her savings, her sleep, and her future. An investor. I gripped the strap of my purse so tightly my fingers hurt because anger was finally coming now, slow and hot, crawling up through the shock, and for the first time that day, I was glad for it. Then Lena said something that made the anger turn into fear. She said Mark had asked her to sign some paperwork too. Not that day. Not yet. But soon. He had told her it was for insurance and emergency contact purposes, something simple before the baby arrived, because he wanted everything clean and protected. That phrase hit me so hard, I had to look away. Clean and protected. That was exactly what he had said to me at the credit union when I hesitated. I asked if she had copies of anything connected to the apartment. She nodded, disappeared into the living room, and came back with a folder so neat and organized that I knew Mark had either prepared it for her or taught her what to keep. My hands trembled as I opened it. The lease was there. The move-in report was there. A furniture invoice was there. And then I saw a page I had never seen before, with my signature copied at the bottom and my name printed above a line that described me as the primary applicant for residential occupancy. For a second, my mind refused to understand it. I had signed a business loan. I had not signed an apartment application. I had not agreed to pay for a second home. I had never even known this place existed. I looked closer at the signature, and the shape was almost mine, close enough to pass if someone was not really looking, but the final curve on the last letter was wrong, because Mark always forgot how I crossed my name when he signed birthday cards from both of us. That was when the thought landed. He had forged my signature. Not once. Maybe not twice. Maybe in places I had not even found yet. The hallway seemed to stretch around me, and Lena started crying quietly. Not dramatic, not loud, just broken in a way that made me realize she was not my enemy, at least not the way I had wanted her to be. I took pictures of every page before she could change her mind. Then I took a picture of the framed photo. Then I asked her not to warn Mark that I had been there, and she nodded so quickly it scared me, because her fear looked too much like mine. On the drive home, my phone buzzed 3 times. All from Mark. First, a missed call. Then a text asking where I was. Then another text that said, "Claire, we need to talk before you do something stupid." I pulled over on the side of the highway and stared at those words while trucks shook my car as they passed. He knew. Somehow, he already knew. And if Mark knew I had found the apartment, then the question was no longer whether my husband had lied. The question was how far he would go to keep me trapped inside that lie. I sat on the shoulder of I-70 with my hazard lights blinking against the gray afternoon, staring at Mark's message until the words started to blur, because there was something terrifying about the way he had written it. Not like a guilty husband begging for forgiveness, not like a man caught in an affair, but like someone warning me that I had stepped into a room where he controlled the exits. "Claire, we need to talk before you do something stupid." That sentence told me more about my marriage than 14 years of anniversaries ever had. He was not sorry. He was not panicking because he had hurt me. He was panicking because I had found paperwork. I wiped my face with the back of my hand, took one breath that did not reach my lungs, and drove home with my phone turned upside down on the passenger seat, because every time it buzzed, I felt like he was reaching into the car and closing his fingers around my throat. By the time I pulled into our driveway, Mark's truck was already there. That alone made my stomach drop, because he was supposed to be at the workshop until 7, and in all the years we had been married, Mark never came home early unless he wanted something, needed something, or had already decided what story I was allowed to hear. He was standing in the kitchen when I walked in. No jacket, no shoes, phone in his hand. He looked calm, which somehow scared me more than if he had been screaming. I set my purse on the counter, kept my hand close to the zipper where my phone was recording, and waited for him to speak first, because a nurse learns that silence makes people show you where the wound is. Mark stared at me for a long moment, then said, "You went to Dayton." Not a question. A charge. I asked him why my name was on an apartment lease I had never seen. His face twitched, just once, near the corner of his mouth, and then he gave me the most exhausted sigh, like I was a child who had misunderstood something simple and ruined his day by being emotional about it. He said the apartment was temporary housing for a business associate. He said Lena had been helping with the Dayton project. He said she was vulnerable, pregnant, and alone, and he had stepped in because he was a decent man, because apparently even his betrayal needed to wear a costume of charity. I asked him why there was a framed picture of him kissing her forehead. He blinked slowly. Then he said she was unstable. That was the first time his story truly broke open. Not because the lie was clever, because it was cruel. He said Lena had developed feelings for him, that she had taken the picture out of context, that she had been trying to create a fantasy, and that I had walked straight into her manipulation because I was tired, stressed, and already suspicious. I laughed then, but it came out wrong, almost like a cough. I asked him if she had also imagined the baby dresser, the nursery clothes, the apartment application with my forged signature, and the fact that he had told her I was his divorced ex-wife. For the first time, Mark's face changed. The charm drained out. The tired husband mask slipped. And what stood in my kitchen was someone I recognized and did not recognize at the same time. He put his phone down very carefully, leaned both palms on the counter, and said, "You need to be careful with words like forged." That was when I knew. Not suspected. Knew. I was not dealing with a messy affair. I was dealing with a man who had planned financial damage around my trust. He stepped closer, lowering his voice, and told me that if I started throwing accusations around, I could destroy the business, destroy our credit, destroy Emma's college plans, and destroy the only chance we had of paying back the loan without losing the house. There it was. The hook in the mouth. He was using our daughter now. I felt something inside me go very still. Mark knew exactly what Emma meant to me, because he knew I had stayed through years of loneliness partly to give her one stable home, one normal dinner table, one set of parents who showed up at concerts and parent meetings without making her choose sides. So when he said her name, he expected me to fold. For a second, I almost did. Then my phone buzzed inside my purse. I glanced down, and on the screen was a message from Lena, sent with a photo attachment. The photo showed a hospital intake form. Mark was listed as the baby's father. And beneath that, in the emergency contact section, was my name again. My name, my phone number, my address. As if I were some invisible safety net under the life he had built with another woman. I opened the second photo Lena had sent, and that was the moment my whole body went cold, because it was not an apartment document, not a lease, not a furniture invoice, but a scanned copy of a life insurance policy application with my name listed as the proposed insured and Mark listed as the beneficiary. For several seconds, I could not even understand what I was seeing. Then the room seemed to narrow. The cabinets, the sink, the yellow kitchen light, Mark's face, all of it pulled into one sharp point. This was insane. This was not just cheating. This was not just debt. This was not just a selfish man panicking after getting caught. My husband had used my credit, forged my name, moved his pregnant girlfriend into an apartment I was paying for, and somehow had started paperwork that treated my life like a number that could solve his problems if I disappeared from the equation. I looked up at him, and I must have shown something on my face, because Mark's eyes dropped to my phone. "What did she send you?" he asked. His voice was quiet now. Too quiet. I backed away from the counter. He moved around it. I told him not to come closer. He stopped, but only because I said it loudly enough that our dog started barking from the laundry room. Then he smiled, small and bitter, and said, "You really think I'd hurt you?" The terrible thing was, 1 hour earlier, I would have said no. Even after the affair. Even after the forged lease. Even after the loan. Some old loyal part of me would have wanted to believe there was a line Mark would never cross. But standing there with that policy application on my screen, watching him watch me like he was calculating the distance between us, I finally understood that love had made me slow, and fear had just made me awake. I grabbed my purse. Mark said my name. Not loudly. Not angrily. Just once. Claire. And somehow the softness of it was worse than shouting, because it was the same voice he had used at the credit union when his hand was on my knee, the same voice he had used when he told me I had saved us, the same voice that had wrapped a lie in tenderness until I could not feel the blade inside it. I ran for the front door. He did not chase me at first. That almost made me turn around. Then I heard his footsteps behind me, fast and heavy across the hallway floor. I reached my car, locked the doors, and started the engine with shaking hands while he stood outside the driver's window, pounding once against the glass hard enough to make me flinch. His mouth moved, but I could barely hear him over my own breathing. I reversed so quickly the tires scraped against the curb. Then I drove to the only place I could think of where Mark would not dare make a scene: the hospital. I parked in the employee lot, walked straight through the automatic doors, and found my charge nurse, Sandra, standing near the front desk with a clipboard in her hand. One look at my face, and she pulled me into the staff room without asking a single question. That was when I finally broke. Not pretty, not quiet. I showed her the messages, the apartment documents, the forged signature, the insurance application, and the recording from my purse where Mark's voice, calm and cold, said I needed to be careful with words like forged. Sandra listened without interrupting. Then she locked the staff room door, handed me her phone, and said, "Call the police from mine, not yours." Before I could answer, my own phone lit up again. This time it was not Mark. It was Emma. Her text was only one sentence. "Mom, why is Dad at my school?" The moment I read Emma's text, every fear I had been trying to keep inside my body turned sharp and immediate, because Mark could lie to me, corner me in our kitchen, twist my name through forged documents, and turn my trust into debt. But our daughter was the one place I had never believed he would bring the mess he had created. I grabbed Sandra's phone, called Emma before I even called the police, and when she answered, her voice was small in a way I had not heard since she was little and scared of thunderstorms. "Mom, Dad's here," she whispered, and behind her I could hear lockers slamming, teenage voices echoing, and that flat school hallway noise that suddenly sounded like danger. I asked where she was. She said she was in the choir room with MS. Belle, because Dad had shown up at the front office saying there was a family emergency, but Emma had seen his face through the glass and felt something was wrong, so she told the secretary she needed to get her backpack and went straight to her teacher instead. That tiny decision probably saved us from something worse. I told her to stay with Ms. Bell, not to leave with him, not to argue with him, and not to believe anything he said until I got there or until an officer arrived. Then I heard Mark's voice in the background. Not close, but close enough. "Emma, sweetheart, come on, we need to go." My knees almost gave out. Sandra took one look at me, pulled her keys from her pocket, and said she was driving because I was shaking too badly to hold a steering wheel, and I followed her through the hospital doors with my phone in one hand and her phone pressed to my ear. On the way to the school, I called 911 and told them my husband had forged financial documents, that I had just found out he had started a life insurance application in my name, and that he was now at our daughter's school trying to remove her after I had confronted him. Saying it out loud made it sound impossible. Like a crime show. Like someone else's life. The dispatcher's voice stayed calm, but I could hear the shift in her tone when I said life insurance, forged signature, and minor child in the same breath. She told me officers were being sent. She told me not to approach him if he became aggressive. She told me to stay on the line. But I was a mother before I was a sensible person, and all I could picture was Emma's face, pale and frozen, while her father tried to pull her into whatever desperate plan he had built in the ruins of our family. When we reached the school, 2 police cars were already near the front entrance, their lights spinning silently against the brick walls, and I saw Mark's truck parked crooked near the curb like he had pulled in too fast. I got out before Sandra had fully stopped. An officer stepped in front of me, asking if I was Claire Mitchell, and I nodded while trying to look past him, because through the glass doors I could see Mark standing in the lobby with his hands raised slightly, smiling that calm public smile he used when he wanted strangers to believe he was the reasonable one. Then I saw Emma behind Miss Bell near the attendant's office, clutching her backpack against her chest. She was crying, not loudly, just enough that my heart broke in a clean, silent way. Mark saw me through the doors. For 1 second, his face changed. The smile vanished. And what replaced it was not guilt, not shame, not even fear. It was anger. The kind of anger a person shows when the thing they thought they owned starts moving out of reach. I tried to go inside, but the officer told me to stay outside until they understood what was happening, and I remember wanting to scream at him that none of us understood what was happening. That my whole marriage had become a locked room full of papers with my name on them. After 10 minutes that felt like an hour, they brought Emma out first. She ran into me so hard that my shoulder hit the side of Sandra's car, and I held her with one arm around her back and the other around her head, because I needed to feel that she was real, safe, warm, and still mine. She kept saying, "I didn't go with him, Mom, I didn't go with him." I told her she did everything right. I told her she was brave. I told her none of this was her fault. But even as I said it, I knew those words were too small for what she had just seen, because children can survive a parent's mistake, but it is different when they watch one parent become afraid of the other in a public place with police cars outside their school. Mark came out 20 minutes later. Not in handcuffs. Not yet. He walked beside an officer, speaking quickly, gesturing with one hand, trying to explain that this was a domestic misunderstanding, that I had become emotional after discovering an affair, that I was twisting business paperwork because I wanted to punish him, and that he had come to get Emma only because he feared I was unstable. There it was again. The word unstable. First Lena. Now me. He was building the same cage around everyone who could expose him. I looked at the officer and said I had documents, messages, photos, and an audio recording, and when Mark heard that, his head snapped toward me so fast that the officer noticed. That was the first time I saw real fear in his eyes. Not because he had lost me, because he might lose control of the story. We spent the next 4 hours at the police station, where Emma sat wrapped in Sandra's cardigan while I explained everything in pieces, jumping from the loan to the apartment, from Lena's messages to the forged signature, from the hospital form to the insurance application, while 2 officers took notes and asked me to email every file before Mark could pressure me into deleting anything. Lena sent more while I was there. Screenshots. Voice messages. A photo of Mark's driver's license on her kitchen counter. A text where he told her not to worry about the lease because Claire's name makes approval easier. That one sentence made the officer stop typing. He read it twice. Then he looked at me differently. Not like a wife in a messy marriage anymore. Like a victim in a financial crime. By midnight, Emma and I were not allowed to go home without an officer escort, so Sandra insisted we sleep at her house, and I did not argue because I was too tired to pretend pride mattered. But before we left, a detective told me something that made the floor seem to shift under my feet again. He said the insurance application was not complete, not active, not valid yet, but it had not come from nowhere. Someone had submitted enough personal information to start the process, including my social security number, medical history, employer details, and a scanned copy of my driver's license. I asked how Mark could have all of that. Then I remembered. The loan folder. The credit union. The night he sat beside me at our kitchen table, saying he needed copies of everything so he could keep the refinance process clean and protected. Clean and protected. That phrase again. I went back to Sandra's house with Emma asleep against the car window, and for the first time in my adult life, I understood that a person can be married to you, eat dinner beside you, kiss you goodnight, and still be quietly gathering the pieces needed to ruin you. Sandra made tea neither of us drank. Emma slept in the guest room with the light on. I sat at the kitchen island, staring at my phone, watching unread messages from Mark stack up one after another. First anger, then pleading, then apologies, then threats hidden inside concern. At 2:13 a.m., one final message came through from an unknown number. No words, just a photo. It was my house, our front porch. The lights were off, and on the welcome mat sat the blue loan folder I had left locked inside Mark's office drawer. The photo of my front porch sat on my phone screen like a threat wearing the shape of an ordinary object, because that blue loan folder had not been in the kitchen, not in my car, not in some open drawer where anyone could find it, but locked inside Mark's office cabinet, behind the printer, paper, and old tax files, in the one place he always told me not to touch because business records were complicated. For almost a full minute, I could not move. Sandra stood beside me at the kitchen island, wrapped in her robe, reading the image over my shoulder with the same quiet stillness she used when a patient's vitals turned bad and everyone in the room understood something had changed. Emma was asleep upstairs, or at least I prayed she was, because I could not survive another look at her frightened face that night. I enlarged the photo with 2 shaking fingers. There was my porch light turned off. There was the crack in the left step Mark had promised to repair last summer. There was the welcome mat I had bought at Target because it said home in soft gray letters, a word that suddenly felt so cruel I almost laughed. And there, placed neatly in the center, was the blue folder. Not thrown. Not dropped. Placed. Someone wanted me to know they had been close enough to touch my door. I told Sandra not to respond, not to call the number back, not to do anything that would give whoever sent it the satisfaction of knowing I was scared, even though fear was already moving through me like ice water. She took my phone gently, sent the photo to the detective, then set it face down on the counter as if the screen itself had become dangerous. A few minutes later, the detective called and told me not to go near the house, not for clothes, not for documents, not for anything, because if Mark or someone connected to him had placed that folder there, the porch might be part of the message, and the message was escalating. That word stayed with me. Escalating. It made everything feel alive. The affair, the loan, the forged papers, the school, the insurance form, the folder on the porch. None of it was separate anymore. It was one long rope Mark had been tying around me while I kept mistaking each knot for a family emergency, a business problem, a rough season, or another reason to be patient. The detective asked if anyone else knew where Mark kept that folder. I said no. Then I stopped. Because there was one person who might know. Derek Hayes. Derek had worked with Mark for 6 years, first as a carpenter, then as the unofficial shop manager, the kind of loyal employee who knew where the spare keys were, which clients paid late, and which filing cabinets held contracts Mark did not want anyone else reading. He had always been polite to me, almost shy, with a soft Tennessee accent and a habit of looking away whenever Mark made jokes that were a little too sharp. 2 months earlier, Derek had quit suddenly. Mark told me he left because he was lazy, ungrateful, and probably stealing materials. At the time, I had believed him. That memory made my stomach turn. How many people had Mark taught me to distrust before they could tell me the truth? I found Derek's number buried in an old group text about a company cookout, and I stared at it for several minutes before I called, because once you start pulling on one lie, you become terrified of how much of your life might come undone with it. He answered on the 4th ring, voice rough with sleep. When I said my name, the silence on the other end was so long that I thought he had hung up. Then he said, "Claire, are you safe?" Not hello. Not what do you need. Are you safe? That question told me everything. My throat tightened so fast I almost could not answer, and I said I was with a friend, Emma was with me, and the police were involved. Derek exhaled, slow and heavy, like a man who had been waiting for bad news and hated being right. He told me he had left the company because Mark had asked him to backdate invoices, move money through vendor accounts, and sign delivery confirmations for materials that never arrived at the workshop. He said at first he thought Mark was trying to survive a cash flow problem, the kind of desperate business mess owners sometimes create when they are too proud to admit they are failing. Then he saw the apartment address. North River Leasing. The same place. He said Mark had used the business account to pay for furniture, appliances, and a private deposit under what he called client housing, and when Derek questioned it, Mark told him to stay in his lane unless he wanted everyone to know about a mistake Derek had made years earlier with a company credit card. Blackmail. That was the word Derek did not say at first. But I heard it anyway. I asked him about the blue folder. His voice changed. He said he had seen Mark take copies of my driver's license, my social security card, and medical insurance paperwork from that folder after the loan was approved, And when Derek asked why business refinancing needed my health information, Mark said I worried too much and Derek talked too much. I closed my eyes. There it was. A witness. A living person outside my marriage who had seen pieces of the machine Mark built around me. Derek told me one more thing before we ended the call, and his voice got quieter when he said it, as if even over the phone he was afraid Mark could hear him. He said Mark had not been alone in this. There was a man named Calvin Rhodes, a broker who arranged creative financing for struggling business owners, and Calvin had been around the shop more often after the loan, always arriving in expensive shoes, never staying long, and always leaving with envelopes or signed papers in his hand. Derek said Calvin had connections in private lending, insurance applications, rental approvals, and whatever gray little world existed between legal desperation and outright fraud. I wrote the name down on Sandra's grocery receipt with a pen that barely worked. Calvin Rhodes. A name I had never heard in 14 years of marriage. A name that had apparently been walking through the back door of my life while I was packing lunches and paying electric bills. At 7 in the morning, after maybe 20 minutes of sleep on Sandra's couch, I gave the detective everything Derek had told me, including Calvin's name, the vendor invoices, the apartment address, and the fact that Mark had access to my medical and identity documents. By noon, I was sitting in a small interview room at the police station, wearing yesterday's clothes, holding coffee I had not touched, while a financial crimes investigator asked me to describe every document I had signed in the last 6 months. That question broke me in a different way, because I could not answer with certainty. I had trusted my husband. I had signed where he pointed. I had skimmed pages because he said the loan officer had already explained the important parts. I had believed urgency was the same as honesty. And now every blank line I remembered, every folded page, every just initial here, babe, felt like a door I had helped him unlock. The investigator did not shame me. That helped. He said people like Mark depend on trust, exhaustion, and emotional pressure because fraud inside families rarely begins with a stranger in a dark alley. It begins at a kitchen table, with someone you love saying your hesitation means you do not believe in them. I wanted to cry when he said that. Not because it fixed anything. Because for the first time, someone named what had happened without making me feel stupid for surviving it slowly. Later that afternoon, Sandra drove Emma and me to meet with an attorney recommended by the hospital's employee assistance program, a sharp woman named Marisol Vega, who wore a charcoal suit, silver earrings, and the calm expression of someone who had spent her career watching people confuse marriage with unlimited legal access. Marisol listened to my story without interrupting once. Then she placed both hands flat on the desk and said, "From this point forward, you do not speak to Mark alone, you do not sign anything, you do not meet him anywhere, and you do not let guilt answer questions that only evidence should answer." I remember those words because they felt like a handrail. Not comfort. A handrail. Something solid when everything else was falling. She helped me freeze my credit, file identity theft reports, notify the credit union in writing, request full copies of every loan document, and begin emergency steps to separate my finances before Mark could drain accounts or create new obligations in my name. She also told me to prepare emotionally, because men like Mark often became most dangerous when charm stopped working and consequences began. I thought I understood. I did not. That evening, after the protective order paperwork had been started, after Emma finally ate half a sandwich, after I changed into borrowed sweatpants and sat on Sandra's guest bed, trying to remember how to breathe, Lena called. I almost ignored it. Then I answered. Her voice was hollow. She said Mark had come to the apartment. Not knocked. Not called first. Come. She said he was furious, sweating, talking too fast, saying I was trying to destroy him, saying the police were confused, saying she needed to delete every message between them because lawyers could twist innocent things into crimes. Then he asked for the folder. My folder. The blue one. Lena said she told him she did not have it. He did not believe her. He walked through the apartment opening drawers while she stood in the hallway with one hand on her stomach, terrified, and finally seeing the man behind the promises. Then, before he left, he said something she could not stop thinking about. He said you were always the problem, she whispered. He said once you were out of the way, everything would finally be simple. I did not speak. I could hear Sandra downstairs washing a mug. I could hear Emma turning over in the guest room. I could hear my own pulse. Lena started crying and said she was scared of him now, truly scared, because she had found something hidden behind the dresser after he left, something taped under the bottom drawer where he probably thought no one would look. She sent me a photo. It was a small black flash drive. There was no label, no explanation, just one strip of masking tape wrapped around it with Mark's handwriting on top. C.M. Final. I stared at those letters until they stopped looking like initials and started looking like a sentence. Claire Mitchell. Final. And in that moment, I understood that the worst part of my husband's lie had not been uncovered yet. It had only been waiting for someone to open the file. Lena's photo stayed on my screen while the room around me seemed to lose its edges. Because there was something horrifyingly personal about seeing my initials written in Mark's handwriting on a black flash drive hidden inside the nursery dresser that I had unknowingly paid for, as if my husband had taken my name, my credit, my medical history, my signature, my marriage, and now maybe even my future, and reduced all of it to 3 cold letters and one word that sounded like an ending. C.M. Final. I read it once. Then again. Then a third time, slower, because my mind kept trying to turn it into something ordinary, some business file, some final invoice, some client materials, anything except what my body already understood. Sandra came upstairs when she heard my breathing change, and I showed her the photo without saying a word, because at that point language felt too small for the shape of what was happening. She looked at it, then looked at me, and her face hardened in a way I had never seen before. Do not let Lena plug that into anything, she said. That sentence snapped something practical back into me. I called Lena immediately, and when she answered, she was whispering from her bathroom, because Mark had left the apartment, but she was still afraid he might come back. Still afraid every sound in the hallway was his key in the lock. Still afraid the man who had promised to protect her was actually the person she needed protection from. I told her to put the flash drive in a plastic bag, not to touch it more than she already had, not to open it, not to delete anything from her phone, and to call the detective from a number I gave her while staying somewhere public if she could safely leave. She started crying again, and this time I did not feel anger toward her. I felt a terrible, exhausted kinship. Because we were 2 women standing on different sides of the same lie, both realizing too late that Mark had not loved either of us the way he claimed, because love does not require forged signatures, hidden folders, secret apartments, or women whispering into phones like they are reporting a fire. By morning, the detective had the flash drive. By noon, Marisol had filed emergency motions connected to the debt, the forged lease, and the protection order. By 3 in the afternoon, I was sitting across from a financial crimes investigator in a room that smelled like burnt coffee and copy paper, watching him slide printed screenshots across the table while my attorney sat beside me with a yellow legal pad and a face that gave nothing away. The investigator told me they had found files on the drive. Not one file. Dozens. There were scanned copies of my identification, my medical forms, my signature samples, bank statements, pay stubs, credit reports, loan documents, insurance drafts, apartment paperwork, and photographs of pages I had signed without realizing Mark had kept the blank sections above my signature visible enough for someone to reuse. I felt Marisol's hand touch my wrist under the table. Not comforting. Grounding. Because the next page showed something that made me feel like I had been pushed underwater. It was a spreadsheet. My name was at the top. Claire Mitchell. Then columns for monthly income, projected debt load, home equity, life insurance eligibility, pension value, nursing schedule, vehicle value, and something labeled risk window. Risk window. I stared at those words until they stopped looking like English. The investigator explained that they could not yet say exactly what Mark intended, because intent had to be proven carefully, but the spreadsheet appeared to calculate how much financial pressure could be placed on me before bankruptcy, divorce, or a claim process became complicated. A claim process. Nobody said death. Nobody had to. I asked what risk window meant, and the investigator looked at Marisol before answering, which told me the truth before his words did. He said it appeared to reference my night shift schedule, my commute, the hospital parking lot, and periods when I would be alone, exhausted, and predictable. For a moment, the room went silent in a way that felt almost physical. Then I remembered every late drive home from the hospital, every dark stretch of road, every time Mark had told me my tires looked worn, every time he had offered to check the car before my shift, and every time I had thanked him because I thought he was being thoughtful. My stomach twisted so violently I had to press my hand against it. Marisol asked if there were any communications between Mark and Calvin Rhodes. The investigator turned another page. There were texts. Not enough to explain everything. Enough to make the room colder. Calvin had written, "She signs too easy when you keep it emotional." Mark had responded, "She thinks it's for the business." Another message said, "Insurance won't move without clean medical." And Mark had written, "I can get what you need." I covered my mouth with my hand because I was suddenly afraid I might make a sound Emma would somehow hear from across town, even though she was safe at Sandra's house, curled under a blanket, pretending to watch a movie while her childhood quietly split in two. The investigator kept going, gently but firmly, because facts do not become kinder when they are delayed. There was also a draft letter addressed to the credit union, supposedly from me, stating that all funds from the loan had been used for approved business purposes, that I accepted full responsibility for repayment, and that I did not wish to dispute any related charges. My signature was already pasted at the bottom. Not perfect, but close. Close enough for a tired employee. Close enough for a rushed process. Close enough for the world Mark counted on, where women like me are too ashamed, too busy, too loyal, or too scared to challenge paperwork that already looks official. That was when something inside me shifted. Not healed. Not softened. Shifted. I had spent the last 2 days feeling like a fool, like a wife who had missed too many signs, like a mother who had let danger come too close to her child, like a woman who had confused sacrifice with strength until sacrifice became a trap. But sitting there, looking at that forged letter, I stopped blaming the version of myself who had believed him. She had been tired. She had been loyal. She had been manipulated by someone who knew every password to her heart. And now she was gone. In her place was a woman with evidence, a lawyer, a detective, a daughter to protect, and a very clear understanding that silence would only make Mark stronger. That evening, officers arrested Calvin Rhodes first. Mark was arrested 2 hours later outside a gas station near Springfield, carrying a duffel bag, $6,000 in cash, 2 burner phones, and my old passport, the one I had reported missing after a trip to Florida 3 years earlier. When the detective told me, I did not feel relief at first. I felt hollow. Relief came later, in small pieces, like warmth returning to frozen fingers. Emma cried when I told her he would not be coming to Sandra's house. Lena cried when the detective told her she could be moved to a safer place before the baby came. And I sat on the edge of Sandra's guest bed that night, staring at the wall, realizing that the man I had once trusted to drive our daughter to school had been carrying my passport like I was something he could move, erase, or use whenever his plan required it. The next weeks were ugly. There is no clean way to explain how a life comes apart when police reports, loan disputes, divorce filings, school counselors, victim statements, frozen credit, and a teenager's broken heart all arrive at the same table. Mark called from jail twice before the no-contact order tightened. I did not answer. He wrote one letter through his attorney, saying he had been under pressure, saying Calvin had manipulated him, saying he never meant for things to go this far, saying I knew the real him and should not let one terrible season erase 14 years. Marisol read the letter first and asked if I wanted it. I said no. Then I changed my mind. Not because I missed him. Because I wanted to see whether he ever said the words, "I am sorry." He did not. He said he was scared. He said he was desperate. He said he felt cornered. But he never said he was sorry for what he did to me, to Emma, to Lena, or to the unborn child he had already dragged into a life built on forged signatures and borrowed money. That was the final answer I needed. The court process moved slowly, because real consequences do not arrive with dramatic music. They arrive through forms, hearings, continuances, statements, and people in suits saying terrible things in very calm voices. The credit union froze collections while the fraud investigation continued. North River Leasing removed my responsibility after the forged application was documented. The insurance company confirmed that no active policy existed, which let me breathe for the first time in weeks, even though the attempt itself still followed me into my sleep. Derek gave a sworn statement. Lena gave one too. And Emma, my brave girl, told a counselor that the worst part was not finding out her father had lied, but realizing her mother had been scared and trying not to show it. That sentence broke me harder than anything Mark had said. Because children always know more than we think. One evening, after a temporary divorce hearing, I stood outside the courthouse with Marisol while the sun dropped behind the parking garage, and I asked her whether women ever really come back from something like this. She looked at me for a long time, then said, "Not as the same woman." At first, that sounded cruel. Later, I understood it was mercy. Because I did not want to become the same woman. The same woman had signed under pressure. The same woman had confused secrecy with stress. The same woman had thought being chosen meant being useful. The woman standing outside that courthouse wanted something different now, something quieter, harder, and much more honest. I wanted safety. I wanted my name back. I wanted my daughter to learn that love should never require you to ignore your own fear. And most of all, I wanted Mark to stop being the author of my life. 3 months after his arrest, I returned to our house for the first time without police escort because the locks had been changed, the security system had been installed, and the court had granted temporary exclusive use of the home while the divorce continued. Emma waited in the car because she said she was not ready to go inside. I did not force her. The house smelled stale. Every room felt familiar and foreign at once. The kitchen table was still there, the same table where Mark had slid the folder toward me and asked me to save us, the same table where I had mistaken panic for honesty and a trembling voice for love. I stood there for a long time. Then I noticed something under the edge of the refrigerator, half hidden in dust. A small folded paper. I bent down, picked it up, and unfolded it carefully. It was not a bill, not a receipt, not a legal document. It was one of Mark's coffee notes from those first perfect weeks after the loan, the kind he used to leave beside the machine to make me believe we were healing. Only this one had never been given to me. It said, "After Friday, everything gets easier." There was no date, no explanation, just those 5 words, written in the same soft blue ink as the initials on the flash drive. And as I stood in that kitchen with the paper shaking in my hand, I realized there was still one part of Mark's plan nobody had explained. I stood in that kitchen with Mark's unfinished note shaking between my fingers, reading the words again and again, because there was something more frightening about a sentence that did not explain itself than about one that clearly threatened you. After Friday, everything gets easier. Friday had been the day after I found the apartment. Friday had been the night I was scheduled to work until almost midnight. Friday had been the night Mark had offered, very casually, to pick up my car from the hospital parking lot because he said one of the tires looked low and he did not want me driving home tired. At the time, I had barely listened. At the time, I had thought it was one more ordinary husband sentence. Now, standing in the stale air of the house where I had once felt safe, I understood that ordinary sentences can become terrifying when you finally know who said them. I took a picture of the note before I touched anything else, then I put it inside a plastic sandwich bag from the kitchen drawer, because by then I had learned that evidence mattered more than emotion when someone had spent months making your fear look unreasonable. Marisol gave it to the detective the next morning. For several days, nobody told me much. That was one of the hardest parts, because once you discover a hidden life inside your own marriage, silence stops feeling neutral, and every unanswered question begins to grow teeth in the dark. Then the detective called me into his office, where he had a folder on the table, my folder this time, not Mark's, and he told me they had matched the note with other messages connected to Calvin's phone. They could not prove every part of the plan. He was careful about that. But they found enough to know that Friday was not just another day. There were messages about final paperwork, a pending transfer, a forged statement, and my work schedule, all wrapped inside vague language that men like Mark and Calvin probably thought was clever because it sounded harmless unless you already knew the truth. The detective did not say Mark planned to kill me. Marisol did not let him use words the evidence could not fully support. But when he said my name had appeared beside the phrase claim timing, I felt the last small, stubborn piece of denial inside me finally go quiet. I went home that day and sat in my car outside Sandra's house for almost 20 minutes before I could walk inside, because there are moments when survival does not feel powerful. It feels humiliating. It feels like realizing you almost helped someone bury you by trusting him. Emma found me there. She opened the passenger door, climbed in without asking, and sat beside me with her knees pulled to her chest, looking older than 16 and younger than 6 all at once. I told her I was sorry. She turned toward me and said, "Mom, you didn't do this." I had spent months teaching her to be careful with boys, friends, money, strangers, and social media, but in that moment my daughter taught me the one lesson I had not been able to give myself. Being deceived is not the same as being foolish. Trust can be used against you by someone who knows exactly how beautiful it is. The court process took almost a year. Mark eventually accepted a plea deal connected to fraud, identity theft, forgery, and conspiracy-related charges, while Calvin's case dragged longer because men like him always seemed to have 3 lawyers, 6 explanations, and a talent for standing near the fire while pretending they never touched the match. I did not get some movie ending. There was no dramatic apology in the courtroom. There was no moment where Mark looked at me, cried, and finally understood the damage he had done. When he stood before the judge, he spoke about pressure, debt, bad advice, fear, and how everything had spiraled faster than he expected. He still made himself sound like the victim of his own choices. That hurt less than I expected. Maybe because by then I no longer needed him to tell the truth for me to believe it. The credit union investigation cleared part of the debt from my responsibility, though not quickly and not without endless letters, calls, forms, and nights where I woke up convinced my whole future still had his fingerprints on it. My credit took damage. My savings took damage. My sleep took damage. But my name survived. That mattered more than I can explain. Lena had the baby in early winter, a little boy with a head full of dark hair, and although we never became friends in the simple way people might imagine, we became something stranger and maybe more honest. We became witnesses. 2 women who had stood on opposite sides of the same man's lies, then chosen not to destroy each other just because that would have been easier than facing him. She sent me one photo after the birth. Not of the baby's face. Just his tiny hand curled around her finger. Under it, she wrote, "He will know better than this." I stared at that message for a long time, then wrote back, "So will our daughters." Emma and I moved back into the house for a while, but it never felt like ours again, because some places remember too much, even after the locks are changed and the walls are painted. So we sold it the next spring. Not for a perfect price. Not with a clean heart. But with enough to close that chapter without leaving my whole life trapped inside the rooms where Mark had lied to me. On our last day there, I stood in the kitchen alone, looking at the table where I had signed away my peace because the man I loved had made panic sound like partnership. I did not cry. That surprised me. I just placed my hand on the wood, took one slow breath, and realized I was not saying goodbye to a marriage anymore. I was saying goodbye to the version of myself who believed love meant rescuing someone from consequences they kept creating. A year later, my life is quieter. I rent a small townhouse near Emma's school. I still work as a nurse, but I no longer take every extra shift just because fear tells me I have to earn safety. Emma goes to counseling, sings again, and keeps a small note taped inside her closet door that says, "Ask questions even when your voice shakes." Mine says something similar. It is taped inside my checkbook. Never sign from fear. Sometimes people ask me what the worst part was, and they expect me to say the affair, the apartment, the pregnancy, the forged signatures, or the insurance paperwork. But the worst part was realizing how slowly I had been trained to doubt myself. Mark did not destroy my life in one dramatic act. He did it in soft requests, tired explanations, loving touches, urgent deadlines, hidden shame, and that awful little pressure that made every question feel like betrayal. That is how people lose themselves sometimes. Not because they are weak. Because someone they love keeps moving the line 1 inch at a time. I still have the blue folder. Not the original, because the original became evidence, but a copy Marisol gave me after the case closed. I keep it in a sealed box with court papers, police reports, credit letters, and the note that said everything would get easier after Friday. I do not keep those things because I want to live in the past. I keep them because some women need reminders that the truth was real, especially after years of being told their fear was imagination. And sometimes, late at night, when the townhouse is quiet and Emma is asleep down the hall, I think about that rainy evening in my old kitchen, when Mark slid the folder toward me and asked me to save us. Back then, I thought saving us meant signing my name. Now I know saving us meant something completely different. It meant walking away before his lies became my grave. It meant choosing my daughter over the image of a perfect family. It meant accepting that a marriage can look alive from the outside while something inside it has already turned dangerous. And it meant learning, painfully and permanently, that love without honesty is not love. It is a contract you never agreed to read.